All right, good people. You know what I'm saying? Welcome to another fantastic day of being a full stack engineer with your boy Cam. Um, Today I want to try to run through some full stack concepts, but do it in a way where hopefully the process of talking about it can clarify some of the things that I know folks maybe still struggling with, especially on the front end side of things. So we're going to talk through a full stack app and kind of walk through some of what you will see yourselves doing over the next couple of days for yourselves. And from that, the hope is that, this clarifies a couple processes, both on how we set up this project to how we connect all the pieces. And what we're building is essentially a PERN stack. I know that sounds like a weird word, PERN, but in the tech world, we refer to different stacks with different acronyms. And so specifically in the JavaScript world and working in like kind of the full stack space, you'll hear a lot about different types of stacks. One that's really common within JavaScript is called MERN, MERN, which stands for Mongo, Express, React, and Node. PERN is Postgres, Express, React, and Node. So these are just different stacks that just refer to the different types of frameworks and libraries you're using to handle client-side, backend, and databases and whatnot. So today we're going to walk through the PERN stack and connect the dots there. And in doing so, like I mentioned, hopefully this recaps some of the things that we've been doing in a way that makes it a little bit, makes things make a little bit more sense for us as we're getting going. And so that's the goal. If you're ready to go, rocking with me, just give me a thumbs up. If you got questions, it would be great if you could keep them in the chat for now. But yeah, I just want to make sure we're ready to go, ready and willing and able. All right, beautiful. So, in the interest of being a wonderful professor and a wonderful homie and a friend and a developer colleague and a pair programming partner, I'm going to walk us through this process by way of some of what we have to do with the apps that we've been building so far. So if you remember, we were working on an app in these general sessions that was related to curating your favorite links. I called it Fave Links. So we're going to use that as our base for our client side, but we're going to talk more today about setting up the back end and making sure that we get that connectivity between Express and Postgres and in our Node application. So that's what we're going to start with. So first things first, I want to talk about Postgres, right? And so Postgres is a database. It's an open source relational database that we can get access to use in a number of different ways. And so if you're familiar with SQL, then you know about relational databases, right? And the idea about databases is that databases run on their own servers and handle the logic of us saving data in a more sophisticated way, right? So Postgres is a great option for databases. There's a number of different types of databases, both relational and non-relational databases. And over the course of your full stack journey, you're definitely going to probably play around with a good handful of them because of the fact that different stacks, different programming requirements make it so that we need to have an understanding of these different databases and how they work and when might we use one versus the other. But oftentimes you'll find, especially as you're getting started, it doesn't matter which ones you use, so long as you can connect to them. And you find that the process of making those connections is pretty similar across the board, depending on which database you end up choosing to use. And so in order to kind of go through everything that we're going through, you're going to want to make sure that you get Postgres installed on your machine. And I believe if you go to the download section here on the Postgres website, there's a couple different packages and installers that you can use for your particular machine. So if you're on Windows, you can grab the Windows installation here. On Mac, you can either download this through the Postgres website like so, or you can use Homebrew and get it on your machine there. If you're using a Linux machine, same thing. You can grab the particular installation that you need for yourself. And so because I'm on a Mac, I used Homebrew to install it. And the way that that looked for myself, let me just open a new terminal for us to take a look at in 1 second. Sorry, I got a crazy amount of terminal windows open right now. So what that looked like, right, is if I were to be doing this over again, I just wanted to make sure that, first of all, I had Homebrew installed on my machine and for Macs, and then I could have done the command brew install PostgreSQL like this. And running this command then, just like as if you did it with one of these installations, would make sure that you have Postgres installed on your machine. And the way that Postgres works is it is both so when you install Postgres, you're installing the necessary tools for you and your machine to launch and then create this structured database, but you also get command line tools associated with it as well that are that make it so that you can leverage those particular, you can basically make commands to that particular database in order to start querying it, adding data to it, and essentially working with it from your local machine. And the ways that we normally work with databases is through the command line, right? Creating commands that talk to our database and send data to it, add data to it, and whatnot. The thing about SQL, Postgres, and other kind of SQL-based, SQL-based databases is that there's particular syntax that we use in the command line to achieve those various database calls, whether we're in creating tables, inserting to the tables, updating data. There's particular syntax, and we'll talk about some of that. But more than anything, working with these databases requires us to have the ability to connect to them via the command line. And so after you've installed Postgres on your machine, you'll be able to then connect to it via your command line as well. And so the way that we interact with Postgres, particularly on the command line, is by way of using what we call the Postgres interactive terminal. And the way that we do that is by way of leveraging those command line tools I was just mentioning in order to start the process of connecting and working with our database. And so the command that gets installed with this is the PSQL command, which will allow for us to connect and work with our work within the Postgres interactive terminal. So if I just kind of go ahead and just do PSQL-help, you can see that that command comes back with some data to just make it known that, hey, we can actually call some things on that with that particular command. It's installed on our machine and everything's working as we would expect. So to connect to our Postgres database, right? First thing we want to do is, let me just clear this terminal real quick, make it a little bigger. The first thing we want to do is set up an actual database that we can use and work with, especially kind of in this stage of building out some development stuff for ourselves, right? So first thing I want to do is kind of run a command to get into the interactive terminal. And you can see now here at the bottom, just give me a thumbs up if you can see this. No, it's kind of weird the way that this added all this extra space at the top. I don't know why I did that, but if you can see, we're here in the command line, but now after running this command, we're in the interactive terminal where we're waiting for a command to type into Postgres. And so what you see here with this, it's kind of weird to figure out how to call this this sign these days, right? Pound sign, sometimes we call it a hashtag, right? This operator right here is letting us know that we are in root access mode. So we are the super user of our machine, which is good for us in the sense of like setting things up, but you don't normally want to run all of these commands on your super user just for security purposes. So what happens typically is we'll create different users for our database that will be responsible for writing to the database and doing specific actions. And so one thing that comes up, especially within server-side stuff, is that one thing that comes up specifically in the server-side thing is that we have one thing that comes up specifically within the server side is just this idea of creating specific managed roles so that you give access where access is needed, but not giving full access when you don't need to give full access to things. And so as the super user of your machine, right, you have a lot more privileges than, let's say, a guest user on your machine, right? And so if something were to happen and somebody were to get hold of your passwords or like get access into your super user account, right? They could perform a lot more malicious actions than if you limit the amount of actions that that user can take by default, which is what I really mean when I talk about like kind of the security things. And in general, those same practices kind of apply across the board when we work with servers and start working with creating machines in the cloud and giving access to different parts of our machines. And so now that we kind of have access though to Postgres, we wanted to just make sure that we have these things working and running well. So one thing I want to do next is just kind of check the connection info to just kind of see what's going on here. And here you can see that two things that are very important. One is that I'm connected to Postgres with my particular super user on my computer, but also this particular port is where the Postgres database server is running. So remember when we were talking about backend, we talked about servers, client servers, right? And we built a server in JavaScript using Node and Express, but there's so many other types of applications that run using servers, right? And one that's very important and common and even, I would say, imperative for you to know as a full stack engineer are database servers. And remember when I told you that by default, some of these servers have specific ports that they run on, right? And so clearly, as you can see, the default port for Postgres servers is 5432, right? This doesn't mean that we can't change these things. But it's good to know kind of, hey, maybe I don't want to put my React code or put my Express server on port 5432 because it might come in conflict with another, a Postgres server that might be running later on that same machine or on that same server, right? So just good to know some general, just generally speaking, like what kind of ports do different servers run on by default? But cool. So now that we have this connectivity to our Postgres database, right? We want to be able to manipulate and start adding certain things in order to make the process of working with this database a little bit easier, right? So there are a couple things to know, right? Once you get into the interactive terminal, as you can see, we run a lot of commands using the slash and then the name of the command we want to run. So when you're in the interactive terminal here, if you want to get out of it, you can do /q, which would quit and get you back into your main kind of terminal shells based on wherever you are running, Windows or Mac or Linux. So the thing is, though, I do want to kind of stay in this interactive builder just for a second, just so that we can talk about the whole process of creating a user. So in Postgres in the interactive terminal, when you're in the super user mode, you could create a role on your particular database that will be responsible for handling actions that you define for it to do with regards to particularly creating different actions that a particular user of your database might be able to do. So just for context, right? One particular thing we could do is create a new user, and let's call that user maybe like me, right? Or I could just say the user, right? If I want to. and give that particular user the option and the ability to work with our database. So first we got to give it the ability to log in to the database. And so the command to do that would be to create in Postgres, in SQL, you see a lot of commands that are all capitalized. So just be mindful of that when you start working with it. So sometimes I just like to put caps lock on when I'm working with these commands. So create role. Here we can give a name of the particular user. So in one context, and I already created one called me. So I'll just do this for now so you can see what would happen. Me with, and then we can say login, and then give it a password, like a default password to use. And here, you know, I'm doing this for demonstration's sake. If I wanted to give this a a more secure password, I could, right? I'll just do password backwards for now to just give you the idea, right? In this with a semicolon, and this would be a command if we ran this that would create a new user with the create a new user called me and give it a default password to log into our database. Again, this database is running on my local host. It's not on a production server, so it's not really in the best position for somebody to hack me about it. So, and I feel confident showing this to y'all because I can just change these things later. But either way, this would be the command if we wanted to create a new user with a particular username and a particular default password to log in. If I pressed enter here, this would go ahead and create that new role for me. But like I mentioned, I already did this a little bit earlier. So I'll just show you how we can check to see what's going on here. So I'll just use this command to print all of our users, right? And so here you can see my super user account, which is tied to my computer, right? By nature of just installing Postgres, getting it running. I had my root access on my machine, had root privileges on the Postgres database. But once I created that, once I ran that command we saw before, I created this new user called me with the permissions to create a database. And you can add the permissions to, for that particular user to create a database, right? After you run that first command to create it, then you can run another command to just alter the role of that particular user, and then you give it the permission that you'd like to give it. So create DB is a particular permission on Postgres that will allow for this particular user to then create a database, right? And by way of having the permission to create a database, then that user has the permissions to modify and all of that with the databases as well. As you can see with the super user, there's just a lot more roles that user has available to it. And so this is just a good, this process of segmenting permissions based on a user is called identity access management. And that's a huge field in the space of all things on the back end, cloud, cybersecurity, right? So identity access management for those of y'all who are interested in more of those security-based things going on behind the scenes here. So running those two commands, and then if you ran the /du command, you'll see on your Postgres something similar where you have one super user account and then the new account that you just created. So the dope thing now that we have this now that we have this new user kind of created, we can go ahead and quit the root access. Oops, my bad. Caps lock. We can quit the root access and we can log back into our Postgres server that's running by way of using that new user that we created. So to do that, right, you can run the command to start your Postgres interactive shell again. And we can go ahead and just say, we're going to add the -u flag to say, hey, we're going to add this user and we're going to log in with that username that we had before, right? So in doing that, now you see that there's no # here, which is making it so that it's showing us we're not in super user mode, right? Anytime you see that #, it's showing that you're in like super user mode on your terminal. So click here, we're just in kind of a standard user process, and this is great. Now we can create a database And because we gave that particular user those particular permissions to run. One thing I will say is the way that Postgres works on your machine, you have to essentially, you have to make sure that the system is running Postgres in the background. So by default, when you first install it, right, all these commands get started, but then you have to essentially start the Postgres instance in your particular terminal. So there's particular commands on Mac and Windows that let you run a new system process. I'll make sure that I drop some links to those for your particular machine, just in case, because if you see here, you see how it keeps saying Homebrew is running this. This is because the Homebrew is running the instance, it's starting the service of running Postgres and the backend of my machine. Somebody said, do you need Docker to run Postgres in production? So you can use Docker to run Postgres in production. Docker is more for kind of organizing how you're shipping your code in production, is not necessarily what's responsible for running the Postgres. But in order to run the Postgres in production, you just need to make sure that on your server, you start the Postgres service on your particular server type. So on the Mac, using Homebrew, I could do it through Homebrew. I think in here, when I go ahead and talk about, I'll find it and I'll make sure that I add it to all of the descriptions and stuff so that y'all see it. But there's particular commands that you would run on Windows to start the Postgres instance to be running on your server. So you don't need, you could use Docker to manage the hosting of the Postgres server instance that you have, but you would still need some kind of terminal-based command line that script to run to start the particular Postgres instance. No problem. All right, cool. So back to this. Now that we have the Postgres set up, we have our new user created, right? Like I mentioned, we can start creating databases now, which is really the fun part, the essence of what we're here to do today. So to do that, right, I can create a new database by running the command create database, and I can give this database any particular name that I want to give it. So for me, and for the sake of what we'll be doing today, right, I might want to create a new database called, let's just say, I can just call it Babe Links for now, because I already created another one with a different name. So I'll just do this. And as you can see, we get this kind of confirmation of the command that said it ran. So with Postgres, if a command runs successfully, you'll see that it kind of gives you this reiteration of the command to say, okay, we did it. So now that I created this database, right, I can go ahead and let's say list out all of our running databases, all the databases we've created. So as you can see here, there's a couple databases already in there. The two that we gotta that I just put mindful for y'all are this one, which is the one we just created, and then I had created this one earlier, right? And I know who is the owner of that particular database based on this table here. So the three that we see at the bottom are the super user created tables that get started when we first launch Postgres. Some of these tables are used for managing kind of the really important I don't want to call it back, the really important data that Postgres uses for things like who are all the users, and you know what I mean? So that's why the owner is the super user and why it was created off rip, right? So you don't really have to you don't have to concern yourself too much with those other three databases that you might see on your list when you run this. Just, be mindful of who's the owner and if you had any access privileges that needed to be added to those particular databases. For us, using the user we created, we don't have any access privilege requirements or anything like that, but we can make use of any of these two databases that I created this one earlier. So you might not see the one that says API unless you go ahead and create a new database called API. And all right, so dope. So now if I want to connect to a particular database, right? I can do that by way of running another little command here. The /c will allow us to connect. And then we type in the name of the database that we want to connect to. And now it'll show, hey, you're connected to the database with that particular user. So cool, we're rocking and we're rolling. We're making a little bit of progress, making some waves here and keeping it going. So the way that Postgres and other SQL-like databases, relational databases work are they structure data in tables. So we have a database, and you can think of a database like this, let's say like a big container, right? And then we create tables inside of that database that hold different bits of data, right? And you can think of it like we have this big box, a big container, and then as soon as you create tables, you're almost creating like a Tupperware of little different compartments, right? And each of those compartments have their own ability to save different data, right? And you can define what gets saved in each compartment, but they're all in the same big database, the same container. So databases and then tables, right? So you want to be kind of aware of like, hey, you might have one database that has multiple tables, or you might have, one database with one table, right? Depending on how what your needs are in the particular moment of building that you're in. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our first table, and this is going to be a table responsible for helping us just start our process of building out this little application for ourselves. And so the Favelinks app is an application that essentially the user would give us a name, a URL and a name, and we would basically kind of store that in a table, in a HTML table. But now we're going to store it in a database table so that we have the data being saved and persisted well beyond the app. So what I want to do is create that table first. So first thing I want to do is create a table. We're going to call it, let's call it Favelinks, or let's just call it links. And I just don't want to get it confused with the name of the actual database. In here, I got to define a couple different parameters for the particular database, right, for the table. So some of what I want to have here is, I'm just going to type it and then explain what's going on in a second. So first thing is an ID, which we're going to call the primary key here, and then a name, and then we're going to give it a varchar 30. And then give it URL, another varchar 30. And then I just want to close this, put a little semicolon, and cool. So now we created our table. All right, so let me just give some context to what's going on here with relationship to this command that I just ran. So essentially, right, we created a new table. We gave that table a particular name, and then we kind of defaulted the information that we said that table, the type of data that this table is going to hold. So one thing with these types of databases, relational databases, is you have to know upfront what kind of data are you going to have stored in the table, and what are the types of data that you're expecting it to hold. And so here we kind of named two different types of data. One is what we called our ID, which is essentially going to be a updating numerical data that is going to be used to kind of make reference to each individual row in our table as a particular unique value. So you can think of the primary key like the key to the data. So it's like essentially each data will have its own key, and like that key is represented as what we call an ID. So every item in our database, every item in our table, will have its own ID that we can use to make sure that each value is unique. And as we start moving things around, right, those IDs are gonna we can reference the things based on those IDs, right? To say, hey, I want to access that particular piece of data, right? We can refer to its ID. The serial command here is what will make it so that it automatically kind of increments for us as we add things to the database. And primary key is a very important concept in databases like this, wherein we use the primary key to basically say that this will be how, this is the unique key that we can use to refer to like each row of the table uniquely. So these are just kind of some SQL and Postgres kind of basics here. Cool. So the second piece of data that we created is called a varchar, right? And you can think of this as simply as like the data type that we use to hold strings, right? So if you're familiar with a string, kind of in any programming language, right, we talk about strings being sequences of characters, right? So that's where the char part of this is coming from. The 30 here is just referring to how big of a how big is that particular string going to be. So there's different types of lengths that we could give this based on the size. And, you know, for the sake of right now, just using 30 is good for us. And I think if we go and look at W3 Schools has a great, some great resources on some of these things as well. I think they have a guide to, they have a guide to SQL. And in here, I think we could see some of the other data types. Oh, right. So here you can see some of the other data types if you wanted to know a little bit more. So here, what we're doing is when we say size of 80, we're just saying this maximum length of the string will be 80 characters, right? So we're just changing, and you can change that size to be whatever you need, but just for the sake of right now, I think 80 characters is more than enough. But yeah, there's a couple different other types of data for like numbers, you know, integers, Boolean values, right? One thing you'll note is, hey, you know, well, with SQL, there's no like object data type, right? Well, we can't just store an object. It looks like we can only store strings and numbers and Booleans, kind of like the primitive data types that we're used to. And that is one reason why other folks might choose not to use a SQL-based database, is because they want to store things more like objects, right? And other databases like Mongo or, you know, allow for you to structure your data in those different ways. So those kind of come to the differences in between different types of databases that you might consider as you start choosing the database that you want to use and work with. So let's get back to this terminal real quick. And so now that we've created this table, we gave it 3 values that each row of data will have, right? So each will have an ID, a name, and a URL, right? So if I wanted to essentially, kind of add some data here, I would have to make sure that I add those values to that data. So I can use the insert into command to say insert into our favlinks table. And then I'm going to just specify the data I want to pass in. So I'm going to say I'm going to pass in the name and I'm going to pass in a URL. And so here I can just type this. And the way that Postgres works is it will wait till you have a semicolon to know that you've ended your command. So by pressing this, enter here, now I can on this second line say, okay, here's what I'm going to insert into. And now it's waiting for me to process that, to pass the values that I want to pass. So the values will be name, let's just call it, I did this earlier, but I'll just say React.js, and or let's just say, let's go based on the stack that we're doing. So we're going to start with Postgres. So I'm just going to put Postgres as a name, Postgres website. And then for URL, let's go back here and copy the homepage URL for us real quick. So go back to the terminal here, make sure I put it in some quotes just to make sure that that's the case, that it knows that it's a string, and end this with a semicolon, and whoops, my bad. Did I give it fave links with a capital L? Database. Oh no, my bad. Insert into links. Whoops. Well, now you go. Now you can see what happens. So remember, fave links is the name of my database. I want to insert into the table that we created. So it would be insert into links. So insert into links, name URL, pass the values that I wanted to pass. And now you see that we inserted a new item in there. And so if I want to take a look at what's saved in there, I can run the command select all with the little wildcard here from links. And this should run to give us a nice little table to show us, hey, here's our first little fave link. And hopefully this looks familiar in terms of like, at least just this idea, right? Of the name and the URL, right? That kind of, that's kind of really similar to what we were building in our client side. So if you recall what I'm talking about with on the client side, just give me a thumbs up, right? That's nice to see that this data is being saved the way that we would expect it to be, to use it in our other app. So hopefully you see where we're going with this, right? Now that we got this working on the back end, we're actually in a great place. So let's put a pause on our Postgres stuff. I'm just going to open a new tab in the terminal, and let's build out our backend and do some of this logical stuff of connecting our Node app to our Postgres server. So 2 servers connecting, what we call that, an API. So let's build this out real quick. So I'm just gonna go to a new place in my computer to better save this thing. And then in here, in my projects folder, I'm going to create a new folder. Let's just call it PERN API, and just change into that directory, my bad. So now we're in here in this new empty folder. And okay, so now that I'm in this folder, all I really want to do is, first things I want to do is I want to create a new server, right? And that server will be an Express server, and we're going to use that Express server to connect to the Postgres instance of our database that we have running. And hopefully we can start making some connected requests and calls to that particular database. So I'm just going to go ahead and start this off like as if I'm starting any new node-based project, right? So I'm going to just do npm init, and I'm just going to do the -y so it runs it for me with all the defaults and things in there. So it goes ahead and it wrote a new package.json for me. If I looked into this directory, you see that there's that new file package.json. Perfect, wonderful, beautiful. You know what I'm saying? We good to go. So with that package.json, that means that this is now a node project that is ready to be, we can start installing packages in here and start using those packages to create our application the way we would expect. So the next thing I want to do is install some packages. I'm going to install, so I'm going to do npm install Express or Postgres. And so 2 things that you might not know. npm install can be shortened to npm I if you want to just use npm I instead of install. They kind of do the same thing. And then you can list a number of packages that you want to install at the same time, just by a space. So if you know you're going to install a couple different packages, then you can just list them here, or you just npm install each one after each one. So go ahead and install Express and Postgres. So if we go to the node package registry and just kind of look at, let's go to package/pg. We'll see more of the information here that is related to some of those packages that we just installed, particularly the PG one, which is related to what we're going to do connecting Node and Postgres, right? So the Node and Postgres are essentially right? They're kind of their own separate libraries with their own separate work. So thankfully, folks have open sourced out, let's call them, let's call it, packages in Node that have allowed for us to make it easier for us to connect to some of the necessary methods that allow for us to make that bridge between Node and Postgres easier for ourselves. There's still things that we have to do, but the Node Postgres package is a very helpful package when you want to connect Node applications to Postgres instances that are going to be running. So shout out to open source community, you know what I'm saying? Because literally nothing would be possible if folks didn't choose at certain points to be thoughtful and giving into the dev community. So that was the PG package. The other package we installed was Express, which we've been using pretty commonly these last couple of sessions. We use Express to create our, we're using Express to help us start the process of creating our servers in these little API instances. So boom, shakalaka, we rocking and making it happen. So next thing I want to do, I will go back here to the terminal. And y'all already know I love to use these little command shortcuts. So because I already installed VS Code into my path, I can use the code command to just open this folder directly in VS Code. It just saves me a whole lot of hard work and puts me right in the exact folder that I need to be. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. So cool. So now we're going to just write a couple lines of code. Just give me 1 second real quick. Sorry. 1 sec, y'all. My bad. Just got to tweak one John later. Asking for some passwords. Go figure. All right. So I think we're good. All right. So here we are in our folder that we created, right? As soon as I started installing packages like Postgres, Node Postgres, and the Express, you can see that the Node modules folder was created for us to hold those packages, which is lit. Just does some good work for us there. Sorry. So with this setup here, we're in a great place to create our server and to make sure that we are able to just stand up a new Express project. So all I got to do now is inside of this folder, I got to create a new file to be our main server. So I'm just going to create a new index.js file, and this will be what we use to kind of start writing out our server-side code. The first thing I want to do in this file is to connect to Express and make it so that we can create a little Express server. So I'm going to do that by just requiring an Express, just require Express, right? And then I want to start a new instance of Express. So I'm going to say Express, and then give it a port equals, let's do 9001. My Dragon Ball Z fans, that was for y'all. And then we're going to go ahead and let's create a route. And the route will just be our root route for now. I'll create a little handler for that route. Request response, open a new function. Here we'll do some stuff. And after that, just do my app.listen. And the app.listen is going to basically take in our port as a parameter. So it also takes in a function. So go ahead and do this. And then here it's going, well, before this, it's actually going to take our port as a value, and then it's going to call this callback function. And here, this is where we will put console log, nice little templated string. The server, I should say the app is running on port. Sorry, get that out of the way. The app is running on port, which will help us see the name of the number of the port. And go ahead. Cool. And so here, what I'll do for now is let's just do res.send and then say hello from the server. All right, save this and cool. We have everything we really need realistically to launch this server. We have Express in here. We're creating a new instance of Express as this app. We give it a port. We created our first route. So routes, and then starting Express. So that's all we needed to do to launch Express, right? So give me a thumbs up. We've seen this a couple times, but I know, like, sometimes, it's good to see it again. But hopefully this part makes sense for those of y'all who've been rocking with me these last couple of sessions, right? As we keep talking about how to use Express. So glad to see that. So here's the thing. I'm gonna save this real quick, and just to test this out, I'm gonna go back to the terminal. I could use the terminal in VS Code. I also just have the terminal right here. So sometimes, depending on my workflow, I use either. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just node index.js. So we get this apps running, so there were no errors. So now if I go to localhost 9001, we would expect to get a nice little message back. Hello from the server. Wonderful. All right, cool. So we have our Express app and that is running. That's great. We're in a good process to keep things kind of pushing and to continue to leverage this Node Postgres library that we also package that we added in earlier, the PG package, to do some other stuff to maybe make it so that we can get some of this data back from our Postgres server. So that's exactly where we're going and what we're going to do next. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder, a new file, and let's just call it queries.js. And this will just be a file for defining the connection to Postgres, as well as some routes that some routes on our database specifically. So I could have named this file anything, but for the sake of I named it queries, and part of the reason why it was named queries is because we're performing queries on the Postgres database to get back the data. So that's why I was called queries here, and in some other places where you might see that. So first thing we got to do is create the connection to Postgres. So connect to Postgres using the node Postgres package. So to do that, first we're going to go ahead and create what we call a new pool, which is going to be a object that gets defined in the Postgres library, in a Node Postgres package that we install. So first we're going to require in the Node Postgres package, and then we're just going to call a new pool, which is essentially a object that will represent the it's an object that represents the connection that we want to form between our Node app and Postgres. I guess it's at a different link there, PG pool. So this is creating a new instance of a pool that will allow for us to establish that connection between Node and Postgres. So that's what we're going to do next. So first, now that we have the pool coming back, we're just going to create a new pool and just say new pool. And in here, we're going to pass some config information to create this new pool. So here you can see the pool takes in some config and information. Some of that information includes just different things related to how we're going to make that connection. But more specifically, what we want to do is tell this pool where's this server hosted, right? What is the host of the server for our Postgres instance? Right now, we know that that is on localhost because we're running it on our local machine. What is the name of the user that we're trying to connect to? Here, these are other config information related to how is it going to make the connection if things happen, how many connections are going to make, etc. So for the purposes of right now, what I want to do is I want to create this new pool. The user is going to be, I'm pretty sure I got to put this in a string. Yep. The user is going to be me, right? So that is the user that we had created earlier, right? The host is going to be localhost, and the database is the name of the database that we created. So we created a database called favlinks, and here I can pass information. I need to pass the information that will allow for this pool to connect. So what I might have to pass in addition to the username is the password as well, right? So here, I'm just going to show you this because I'm going to change it later. But some of what happens here is that we might want to post this code to GitHub, and it's not a good idea for us to post our whole database's password to GitHub, right? That's just not the vibes here. So what we can do is we can, so I'll do this now, but then I'll show you if we have some time in a little bit. I know we're running close to time. We can hide these values, like secret values, using environment variables in our server side stuff, as well as you can do that in the client side too with React. But we can use what are called environment variables to make it so that we pass this data through the environment. And so it's not like we're going to post this on GitHub, right? You can also post those environment values in your GitHub settings so that if you were trying to run some things on GitHub, you could still make these connections. But for now, just because this is development purposes, go ahead and just make that connection this way. And then the port that our database is running on is default port 5432. And so cool. So now we have this, we're creating hopefully a new pool object from Postgres that is going to allow for us to make this connection to our Postgres database. So let's just see what happens when I do this, and go ahead and let's just save this. Go to our, I'll open another tab just for this. And then I just want to do real quick, I didn't do this earlier, but I just want to see what happens. Queries.js. And if you see, we get this really crazy looking object coming back, right? That is showing us our connection to our Postgres database, right? If this wasn't coming back with something, it would have just told us null or something. But clearly we're defining the pool, and we are, we're doing what we got to do here to have this be used for our queries to make some more useful connections to the Postgres instance. So cool. So basically, now that we have all of this, this connection to the Postgres, we have our Node Express server kind of up and running, right? Now we've got to think about how we want to architect this API to work well with our React app and the stuff we're going to be doing with React, right? And so the thing is that APIs are only as good as the routes that we define on them, right? So if I don't have a route for something, then you're not going to get that particular bit of data, right? So one thing that's really important to know are certain architectural patterns that are useful in creating APIs that you will find commonly created based on different applications that you might be running and building and stuff. One architectural pattern that is very common when it comes to APIs and working with databases and all this stuff is the CRUD pattern. So give me a thumbs up if you've ever heard of that word CRUD before. I'll type it here so you can see. CRUD. How many of y'all have ever seen something like this name or anything? Okay, you can give me a thumbs down. That's cool too if you haven't seen it. I appreciate that. All right. So CRUD is essentially a pattern for defining routes on a server that is going to, normally we use it in relationship to like working with data that we're managing. And so for instance, the CRUD acronym stands for create, read, update, and delete. So these would be 4 routes that we would want to create in order to allow for our clients to make requests that can interact fully with our database, right? Create would create data, or like, let's say, add data in our to the DB, right? Read would get would get data from the DB, right? Update clearly would update data in the DB, and then delete would remove data from the DB, right? So if you understand what I'm saying here with like, okay, these 4 methods would be very useful for like a client to interact with our database, right? Just give me a thumbs up, right? That's essentially what CRUD is just saying, hey, I'm going to create these 4 methods to allow for our users to interact with the data in these ways. So they can create data, they can read data, they can update data, they can delete data. So the CRUD part is not really anything crazy. It's just the idea of I'm going to have these types of routes in my server, and so that clients can call them. So we can define those routes here, and we are going to have to at a certain point. But because a lot of those routes are going to make use of this Postgres pool that we have, we might end up creating some of them here as well. So I'm just going to create the first one related to allowing for us to get some data back, right? Because if we remember in our Postgres, we already saw that we have some items here, and maybe, just for the sake of it, since we're already at the part of our next part of the stack, so I'm gonna go ahead and insert a new link in here, insert into links, name, URL, typo, that was gonna mess me up, right? Insert into links, name, URL, and then values are gonna be express. And so let me go ahead and grab the Express NPM package. No, it's not the Express website, but it's all good. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's going to judge us for putting the package in here. And go ahead, put that young little thing there. Cool. Semicolon. And oh, dang. Well, I passed my 30 character limit. I didn't think it would happen, but yeah, there it is. So if I needed to do that, well, that just shows like I gotta make a different choice in what character length I need to do. And we could alter the table and add different columns and any of that, but for the sake of just getting to where we gotta get to, I'm just gonna use the Express website is shorter. All right, groovy. So this should be cool. All right, cool. So again, if I were to select all from the table, I can see that we have those 2 things. And I only just did this so we had a little bit more testing data in here. All right. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our server and talk about this this CRUD, right? So the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to get all the links from database, right? I could say get all the data, just to generalize this a little bit more for y'all based on if you're going to use this for a different project later too. So I want to just create, so if you remember the way that our server routes work, right? If we take a look at the app.get, right? It takes in a path and then it takes in a callback function that will define what we do for our request and our response, right? So thumbs up, y'all see what I'm saying, right? Every route, if I were to create a new route, right, and just like, let's say like /test, right? I need the path, and then I would need this little callback function to call, do something with the response, right? And then this would be the rec and the response, right? So thumbs up, y'all understand what I'm saying, right? Every route is gonna have this kind of format of the path that is the name for the route that we're gonna call, and then the particular handler that gets called when that route finally does get connected. So because this part is just a function, we can actually pass a function into this, right? So if I define a function somewhere else that defines clearly what we're going to do with our request and our response, then I can actually pass the name of that function in later. So that's essentially what we're going to do. In the queries, we're going to create all the functions that will be our request handlers in our Express server. So this is what we're doing here, just creating all those functions. So the first function I want is to get all the data from the database, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new function. Let's just call it, I'm gonna keep the names focused on fave links, but you know, I could make this get data, but I just want y'all to know that I'm particularly working on getting the links back. So gonna get the links. Remember, this has to define what the request and response is gonna do. So here, right, this would be the function that would essentially get passed back into our other server here. So here we got the get links, and this particular function, I want to make use of this pool connection that we created. So we'll go ahead and call the pool, and I want to perform a new query, right? So remember, whenever I was working with Postgres here, I had to pass in a particular query into the interactive terminal. The same thing would apply here, where I'm in my server defining the query that I would pass if I were to be working with the database from the command line. So here, that query is literally going to be the same one that we were working with. Select all from links, and but we're going to just make sure that we order it so that it's ascending order. So we're going to just say order by ID. Remember that in our table, all of these items will have an ID associated to it, right? So the ID will be and just ascending, to just say we want it to come back in ascending order based on the ID, right? So that's why having that ID is really helpful, because now we can grab all of that data. We can also use it to do things like as we're filtering our requests and stuff like that. And cool. So the query takes in both the command, and then it also takes in a function, like a callback function, essentially. So if things work and if things don't work, what are we going to do? So if things work, if things don't work, let's say, we're going to have an error that comes back. If things do work well, we're going to have a results object. So I'm just going to call it result. And then in here, we could just say, hey, if we get an error, right, let's just throw a new error, which essentially will mean that the console will kind of stop working and say, hey, you know, there's an error here, right? But if there is no error, we're going to just say, we're going to use the response that we created, the response object, and say, hey, we're going to send back a status of 200 and send back some JSON that has the results rows, right? All of the rows that are coming back. So basically, we're checking if there's an error. If there's an error, we kind of just throw an error, which basically the throw error, a throw is just essentially going to halt the process of our application running and make sure that that error is kind of prominently displayed, so we know something went wrong. If not, right, this if block is going to get ignored, and we're going to go ahead and just send back our data as JSON with a status code of 200. So we have our first little function for our request handler, right? So essentially, right, if I were to be doing all of the CRUD functions, I would be defining other functions, right? So read, so this is a read function, right? Get links would be a read function. I might have, create a new link in the database, right? So then I would have another function here for creating. Then I have this one for reading, and then I might have one for, update link in the database, right? And then I'd have another function here, right? So, and then lastly, I'd have a delete function in the database, right? So hopefully you see what I'm saying. Like all of these would be where we would have those functions that define the CRUD aspect of our API here. But the one I have so far is the get links. So what I want to do is I want to be able to call this function. I want to be able to call this function get links in my other JavaScript file, right? And we can use exports and imports to do this. If you have a function or an object of any kind in one JavaScript file that you're going to want to call from a different JavaScript file, you can handle this by calling an exports on that particular function. So for me right now, I have I have this get links function, but we can use the exports functions within JavaScript to make it so that we can go ahead and get this data sent over and able to be imported essentially. So to do that, we're going to use these two important kind of objects, the module object and the exports, which allows us to define a list of things that we're going to put as exports from this file. So essentially you just pass inside of these curly braces the various functions or things that you are going to export. They could be functions, objects, anything referenceable from the JavaScript file that you created here, right? So any of these values could be exported if we wanted to, but I really just want to export this function, get links. So I'm going to go ahead and just say get links, right? And then if I had other ones, I could just go ahead and list them out like this. But since I only have get links right now, I'm just going to go ahead and export that. And then back in our index.js, whenever you export using this modules export syntax here, what's going to get sent back is an object, as you can see here, right? So this thing is an object, and that object has a value inside of it called get links. So in order to make reference to that particular object, I'm going to have to make sure that I have the, I'm going to have to make sure that inside of our Express application, we are pulling back in that particular bit of data that we just, we're pulling back in that particular object that we just exported. So I can do that here at the top of the file, and I could just say database or something. I could give it any name. So I'll just give it DB for now, and I'm just going to say require /queries. So when you're exporting a module, if the module is just exported kind of without a name like this, but just an object with certain parameters, you can give it a particular name that you want to use to reference it inside of the place where you're importing it. So here I'm calling it database, but that database is just going to be set to this require statement. Just like when we did express here, we just kind of created a value that was going to hold what was there, right? So this database is the object that has this get links function here. So what I can do is I can actually create our CRUD method here and just say, okay, hey, just like I had here a new route, I'm going to create a new route, one last route app.get, and it'll be /links, and /links will go ahead and, and so instead of having to type in this request response kind of logic here, I already have it inside database.getLinks. So I'm just passing this function, right, that is defined here that has that response and request handler here. already kind of built for us. And the reason, again, that I put it in here was because we had this Postgres pool in this separate file. I could have put everything in index.js, but then it just kind of gets a little clunky, harder to read, stuff like that. And now you know how, if you want to have separate files for different parts of your API, how to import those particular modules into your API eventually, like so. So cool. So we got our first route here. Go ahead, save this. And if all is working, right, we would hope that when we go to app, or when we go to /links on our server, right, this function get links should run, and get links should go ahead, run that query to our Postgres database and get back all of our links, which we know from our terminal instance of Postgres running that we have 2 links in there, right? So hopefully, if all goes well, we have the ability to see this in our server. So what I got to do now is make sure I stop the server, and then start it again because I made some changes. Then we go back to our local host. Just go ahead, make sure it's running. So localhost 9001, the root route is running. So remember, if you don't specify a path at the end of this, the route that is going to be sent is the root default here. So that's where this hello from the server is coming from. So now if I go ahead and do /links, fingers crossed, we get back some information from our database, and voila, we do, right? So just zoom in for y'all a little bit, and you see we get back this array, and inside of the array are a couple objects. Those objects contain our data from our database. It contains our first link with the name Postgres website, and we got the Express in here with the Express website, and cool, it's coming back as an array of data, which is perfect because now, right, now that we have that working, we can use this same API to start interacting with our client-side application to pass some of that information down to the client, right? So essentially, now that we have this API working on our server side, if I want to realistically create a nice full stack application, I would want to have that front end, our React front end, also be able to connect to our Express API as well. And so I'm not going to do the whole thing now because we only got a couple minutes and I want to be mindful of y'all's time, but I will show you how we could start this process, right? And so here, hopefully y'all see what I'm saying, that we kind of have our server pretty good in a good place. So give me a thumbs up if y'all see what I'm saying, right? The server's got in a decent place right now. We have it's running, it's connected to the Postgres, right? All of that's working pretty well. So all we want to do next is make sure that we have a nice client-side application to connect this to. And we've been doing our client-side applications in this full stack context of saying, hey, in this server, we're also going to just have our client-side stuff as well. And for the sake of right now, I think that is a good idea for us to do, to just build these full stack apps out. Over time, you might, like I said, you might host your client separate on a separate server, then you host your server, your Express server. That's just architecturally up to what you're trying to achieve. But for the sake of right now, us learning, right, I just want to create a nice client folder in here that's going to have all of the client side code for the Favelinks app. And lucky enough, right, I created for all of us a nice place where we can get that client side folder, right? It's already on my GitHub, right? The Favelinks starter project. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and go back to copy the link from GitHub, and then inside of our little folder for our project, our PERN API folder, which is our top level folder, I'm just going to go ahead and just run a git clone and pass that in there. And that's going to go ahead, grab all of the data from that Favelinks project that we had already. And now, right, I have this in here. If I were to go back to VS Code, see, we have it in here. And just to make it so that we clear that this is the client, I'm just going to go ahead, rename it to the client, and boom. Now I have the full server side still there. And now we have this really wonderful client side application here as well, right? So give me a thumbs up. Y'all see what I did here. I saved some time. leveraging the fact that we had that front end already in GitHub. So I could just pull it in pretty easily there. So if we ignore all the server side stuff that we were doing, and you just open up the client side and go to the source and everything, right? So this is literally the Favelinks project that we were talking about before, right? Where we had our link container. The link container was responsible for defining some stuff with our form and our table to make it so that our form, as we wrote in the form, it added to the table, right? So hopefully y'all were able to get some of this going on your last go around with this particular project. But just to make sure that we kind of set things straight, there's a couple things that we could do, right? We could work with our React code localhost and just kind of create a proxy between the React and make sure that that is working with our to make sure that that's working with our server. But just to make the case of, hey, you know, we have this client also in this server for a reason, so that eventually, right, when we come down to it, we might be able to host our front end in, we might be able to host our front end instead. And so instead of just saying, hey, hello from the server, right, we might be able to just show our React application from our root route and allow for that to essentially be kind of the place where, hey, if you go to the root route of our app, you can work with the React, but then we have these other routes specifically for interacting with our database, right? And so if you have been kind of following along with us in these last couple of sessions, right, it's not too hard to make it so that we can get our React app to come back on our route, right? In order to do that, right, we got to make sure that we build our React application. So build the client, and then we can host that client as a static file in our, we can host that client as a static file inside of our Express application. So let me just do this real quick before we break. So if I wanted to, whoops, I can minimize that. If I wanted to go ahead and host this this code, right? So remember, the client is a React application. So this application, in order for it to fully get built, it needs to have, we need to run a particular command to build it. So I'm gonna just open a new terminal here. I know I got terminals all over the place, but I'm just gonna open a new terminal just so y'all can see it clearly here. So I'm gonna go into the client folder, right? This is our React application. And first thing I want to do, just I just want to do a quick npm install, because since this came from GitHub, the node modules folder isn't already in there. And then the next thing I want to do is npm run build, which is going to go ahead and first thing it's going to do is it's going to install all the packages for the React app that we need to have things running. And then secondly, it's going to run the build script, which is a script in React that creates for us inside of our client folder. We can see it happen when it finally gets to there. It's going to create a new folder for us called a build, which has our production ready React code that we can use to host our React application on our server. So I'm just going to do this npm install. Hopefully it just takes a couple seconds. And then we're going to go ahead and run the build. And you can see that when we run the build, it will optimize our React code for production use and give us a nice folder inside of our client folder that we can make reference to from our server in order to host the code specifically from our server. And so now that the npm install finished, right, now it's running the build. As you can see here in a second, you'll see that it creates a nice build folder for us in our client, right? And boom, there it is. That build folder contains all of the minified bundled JavaScript code for us that takes all of our components, take everything that we've had in our React, and then builds it for us here, right? So FaveLinks app, okay, so it finished the build, that's great. So the default FaveLinks app wasn't finished, right? So y'all remember that there was a lot of code that we had as to-dos in the React side that we needed to fix, particularly within these components, within like the link container, right? There's certain things that we needed to see. But enough of it is working right now where like if I were to run this as it kind of is, we will still be able to see some stuff. So as a last step, what I want to do is go ahead and just remind us how we can host this on our inside of our server. So what I want to do first is just bring in the path module. So require path. It comes built in when you install Express. It's already kind of installed for us. So we have the path file. And then the next thing I want to do is before I start defining these routes, just want to define some middleware and just kind of say, hey, one of the ones that I want to do is to host this React app. So remember that express app.use is a function, and we can host static files by using this express.static method that turns basically anything at a particular path into static hosted files that we can hold on our, we can put on our server and reference on the server. The only thing is that if we look at the architecture of this, I have the client app. The reason before when we did this, it was -- client was because I actually had the server and I actually had the index.js and queries.js in its own folder. So I could do that real quick just to make it consistent. So I could, just so that we see this is a little bit different, just go ahead, put the index.js in here, move that, and then move this queries folder in here as well. So now we have a server folder and a client folder. So because the server folder the client folder is outside of the server, -- would basically say, hey, if we're inside of the server, right, running this code, this index.js code, right, I have to go up one folder, right, up one folder, and now I can reference the client/build, which is this folder inside of the client. So that's what this line's doing. And the last thing is, now that we have this running, we have this statically hosted, we can run the command to actually send back that file, that same file. We can send back the same file from our server. So here, instead of just res.send hello from the server, I could do a send file and then use the same path.resolve, right, to say, hey, we're going to send back that build folder, but we're going to send specifically back the index.html that's inside of there, right? So the build folder has an index.html that will be the main file that holds all of our React stuff together. So just before y'all slide on me, I'm just going to go ahead and let's redo our server. So just going to stop the server one more time because I made that change. And why is this? Can I find? Oh, my bad. I moved it, so it's not index.js anymore. It's server/index.js. Cool. So now that's running again. And then if we go back to our localhost, right? So localhost/links should still work. That's still working. But now if I go to localhost/, right, we get our React app. So voila, we have our React app. So if our React app was fully built out, right, we could be using this React app to then make all of the necessary changes to our form, our table, and eventually, right, work with the React to connect to the other routes that we have defined here to get back the data. And since we already have the React running on the server on the same, it's being sent down from the server, we don't have to run localhost 3000. We won't have to deal with any of those CORS issues because these are all happening from the same origin. If we don't do it this way and we do it with the localhost 3000, we just have to set up those proxies and stuff to make sure that we can still call these APIs. But by doing it this way, we have everything hosted on the same server. So we should have no problems making use of these APIs to get back the data from the Postgres inside of, let's say, even our link container, right? Which would be probably where we would want to get this data back so that we could send it to the table and manipulate it with the form and whatnot. But now, hopefully, like y'all see, we have a nice running full stack app still. Everything's at port 9001, it's over 9,000. React client side, and then Postgres backend, our node and Express backends connected to this Postgres database via this pool. So we have a really good full stack application skeleton right here that we can continue to build upon and make some changes to. So with that, I'm gonna stop the stream. I appreciate y'all's time and for sticking around. Give me a thumbs up if everything's making a little bit of sense, and I appreciate